on the Zero Hour. I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow. We are so hammered with bad news 24/7, setbacks, disappointments, and all that sort of thing, that sometimes we forget the good things that have happened in our world, which is why one of the reasons why I was particularly looking forward to interviewing my next guest, because I think a lot of us have forgotten what a breakthrough it was when the teachers' strikes began in West Virginia in 2018 or so. And my next guest and his co-author have written a book about it. Brendan Muckian-Bates is a former public educator in West Virginia. He's now a nonprofit worker. His specializations include gender studies, critical pedagogy, and social studies education. He's written for places like Jacobin, Berkeley Review of Education, and new books. And together with Aaron Dyke, he has written a new book entitled Rank and File Rebels, Theories of Power and Change in the 2018 education strikes. So first of all, Brendan, welcome to the program.
Thanks. Happy to be here.
Well, we're delighted to have you. And as I say, to talk about what I consider to be a positive subject. In fact, you and Aaron, in the introduction, I'm going to write, this spoke to my heart. I'll tell you right now. Our main purpose in writing this book, you write, is to reinvigorate the feelings of excitement and raw energy that comprise this shared collective experience among educators and all those listed involved in education labor struggles. At the same time, we hope to also encourage healthy critical reflection to understand several salient tensions that arose and continue to arise within contemporary educator movements. Let's start with this. You were directly involved in the West Virginia strike, is that correct?
Yes. I was a teacher in Morgantown at a local high school for about a year prior to the strike, and then the year of the strike.
And so you had, as you write in the book, in your prologue, it had a personal impact on you, because I think that's something that anybody empathetic always thinks about when a strike action begins, is how does it affect the people who go out on strike? Well, you were one of them. And how did it affect you and your family personally?
I remember my wife and I were looking to buy a house closer to where her family lives here in Moundsville towards the end of 2017. And we found out soon after we had signed the papers to buy this house that she was pregnant with our second child. And so I was making a commute of over an hour and a half one way to go from Moundsville to Morgantown to teach, starting at 7:30 in the morning. And around January, we started to understand more of what this organizing effort that we had been doing from about the summer of 2017 through January of 2018 was going to materialize into. And so there was a lot of heavy lifts at that time, considering we knew that we had just bought a new house. We hadn't gotten rid of our apartment yet, and so we're still paying on that. We weren't sure what our health insurance would be. My wife was finishing her PhD at the time, and so there was just mountains of stress between just what you face as a teacher to also these other compounding issues, that we had so many serious conversations about what a strike action would mean for our health insurance, what it would mean for my paycheck, because at the time I was the only one earning a salary at that time, and just questions about if this would break us.
But you made it through, and I get the sense that one of the I don't want to speak for you, but I get the sense that one of the things that helped you guys get through was the sense of solidarity with everyone, fellow strikers, and the people who supported you. Is that right?
Yeah, I'll tell you a short story. So, like I said, at the time I was in my second year of teaching, I was a building representative, so sort of like a shop steward
Hmm.
for the WVEA, the West Virginia Education Association, for my building. And I had known a lot of individuals in my life who had gone on strike before. At the time, my wife's cousin, Levi Allen, was the secretary treasurer of the United Mine Workers, and he had plenty of stories to tell me. But it wasn't until I talked with some of the folks in my building as a strike was becoming imminent, and I had asked them, well, what are we going to do if people try to cross the picket lines? What are we going to do to keep this an actual strike and stop people from scabbing? And I think it was the gym teacher who pulled me aside and talked with me with the math teacher and said, so and so had been in the mine workers before this, and let's just say he knows how to take care of people who try to scab. And he said, he just put his hand on my shoulder and he goes, buddy, we're not going to let that happen. Don't worry, we know what to do. And it brought me back to thinking about some of the more militant strike actions that the mine workers have been engaged in. The Pittston coal strike from '89 to the early '90s. There were people who would lay down jack rocks to stop trucks from entering. They would physically intimidate scabs. There was a very strong sense of both community solidarity as well as understanding that if you are going to scab, they will have your name down forever and you will not escape that label. And I think there was a mix at that moment of understanding that it wasn't just all on me. It was a sense of we're all going to do this collectively. And at the same time, I understood with my local union, we needed to ensure that students in our county were fed during the strike because none of us knew at the time how long it would last. So I coordinated with all of our other building representatives in the county to get food collected at these schools from parents who could afford to donate more. I met with those building representatives, took it to our high school, and then some of our students who are on their break periods came into the library and helped pack lunches and breakfast for kids during the course of the strike so that students could be fed. And that was one of the moments, I think, when I could see that, there is a sense of support for this action, that it's not just a bunch of greedy teachers going out on strike. Right. It's a whole wide community effort, and many people are behind us more than we think.
And that was one of the striking things about first the West Virginia action, and then as it spread to other states, was, a couple things. One was the fact that you strikers immediately began acting out of a sense of solidarity, not only with your fellow workers at educational institutions and not only with your fellow state workers, although that too, in terms of, I guess, corrections officers and so on, but in terms of the community at large. For example, by ensuring that students who depend on school lunches are fed and so on. So I think that really resonated with a lot of people. And also, I think it reminded a lot of people that, for example, West Virginia, they're often called the red state teacher strikes, right? Because it began in West Virginia, it moved to Arizona, Oklahoma, and so on. Considered red states, not because of socialism, but because they're vote Republican, typically. But it reminded a lot of people that all those states, especially West Virginia, have a long history of labor action and labor solidarity, which is considered a left thing, but is really ingrained in some ways in working communities. So when you talk about social theories and contexts and lessons learned or lessons yet to be learned, it seems to me that those two elements, the solidarity among workers and then the sense of community responsibility and solidarity, that gets reciprocated by the community. That seems to me to be essential to the success of, and obviously we can talk about what didn't work as well, but what was successful about these actions and why they resonated with so many people, including people who might be considered politically conservative or whatever. Does that make sense to you?
I would say it certainly makes sense. Talking with other striking educators, at least here in West Virginia, during the strike at picket lines or at the Capitol, there was a sense that no matter who you voted for, whether at the time it was Jim Justice, who was a Democrat, or I think it was Bill Cole, the Republican, people kind of understood that they really didn't have much of a choice in 2016, that their outcome had pretty much been predetermined electorally, and that the steady course of electoralism and lobbying that had led us here wasn't working anymore. And what was needed was a powerful labor movement that could reignite the fires of rebellion that we had witnessed in the 1990 strike, which followed the Pittston strike pretty much, I think, within a month. And political ideology aside, I think most people ended up recognizing that there weren't really many officials in the state legislature and the governor's office who had the workers' best interests at heart. And that was one of the, I think, more key eye-opening parts of this experience. And we witnessed this in our interviews with educators in Oklahoma and in Kentucky and in Arizona, where you would have people who would identify as more politically conservative, but when they recognize the threats to their jobs, to their pensions, to their health insurance, to the impact it would have on education in their states for the next 10, 20 years, that it didn't matter what you believed ideologically, it didn't matter who you voted for, that this was something that people could rally around. And I think this is something where when we see the larger labor movement kind of shifting now with the Teamsters contract that was just recently ratified, there's this growing movement, I think, that, this quote unquote red state strike that had kicked off a really powerful indictment of where the labor movement had been and reignited a lot of those flames, that once it ended, the shift kind of moved elsewhere. It moved back to larger cities, or it moved to other sectors. But I think even still, we're seeing, especially during and after COVID, education labor movements are critical to what we would say bargaining for the collective good. They don't just bargain for the educators or the support staff themselves. That's certainly part of it, but it's also the direct ripple effects that this has on direct community benefits.
And I can think of a couple of those community benefits, including, food for lower income children, including smaller class size to provide a better quality of education, that kind of thing. What are some of the other community benefits? Any others come to mind?
Sure. In 2019, we formed a rank and file caucus, West Virginia United, after the 2018 strike. And in 2019, the state legislature here was putting forth a charter school bill that would introduce charter schools into the state for the very first time. And one of the things our rank and file caucus was very adept at doing was identifying the costs that charter schools would provide, would end up costing the state long term. And we also quantified the cost for additional school nurses, school librarians, school psychologists. Many students in this state are raised by grandparents. So there's a whole host of socioeconomic factors that directly impact the students that teachers in West Virginia serve. And by going forth and saying, if you're going to put forth money, essentially throwing it away for private investments in charter schools, that money could be better served by directly supporting students and their psychological needs, their material needs, so that when they come into the classroom immediately, they're there and they're able to learn because all of their previous needs have been met. And until that happens, teachers and support staff are going to continue to have to deal with those issues themselves with significantly limited resources, but that also directly benefits families as well.
And one of the things that I think, one of the messages that's gotten lost in recent decades about organized labor, about unions, about strikes, and the other ways in which workers can exert power through organization is that they do benefit the community as a whole in a variety of ways, including even the simplest, that more income for workers means more money flowing back into the community, and so on. So as well as all these other benefits, and the fact that from its early days, the labor movement represented these kinds of community services and improvements in community well-being. One of the things that impressed me a great deal about the West Virginia teachers' strikes and later the actions in other states as well was the warm reception they seemed to get from the community as a whole. You know, we had come out of decades again of some of the same interests that were supporting and backing charter schools, somehow communicating the idea in the media that teachers were elites or wanted too much for themselves, or kind of trying to cleave them away from other workers and from the working class, and saying, well, you know, they're overpaid, various ways of trying to discount the teaching profession. Teach for America, it almost implies, well, anybody can do that, as opposed to it being, you know, a difficult and a profession requiring specific skills, and on and on. So it seems to me, you know, there's been a concerted effort over many years to alienate teachers in particular from less educated or blue collar or lower income groups of all kinds. And it struck me that one of the things, of course I wasn't there, but one of the things that seemed striking about it was, you know, teachers on strike and parents cheering them, community members supporting them, and so on. I'm sure there was opposition as well, but were you all surprised by the amount of community support you received, or am I overstating the amount of community support you received?
No, I don't think you're overstating it. And I think you really lay out a very good history leading up to the 2018 strike, which was, you know, this didn't happen in a vacuum. This didn't happen solely in a few states. This was both a national as well as state level concerted effort to break the backs of public education. I remember watching the documentary Waiting for Superman years ago, and this understanding that, you know, union teachers are just overpaid, they get fat bloated benefits and don't actually educate the students that they serve. And so anything you can do to revolutionize or change education to better suit the changing workforce, it always came down to, how do you break teachers' unions? How do you break the backs of the people who actually do this work? And any educator you talk to will tell you, when you go into the first few days of the school year before the students come in, oftentimes there's going to be a speaker or someone who's discussing like a new theory on how to teach, and the first question that educators always ask is, how long have you been in this profession? You know, if you're just coming in here from a policy perspective, or you're coming at this without ever stepping foot in a classroom, or you were here maybe, you know, 10, 20 years ago, you don't understand what educators are doing on a day-to-day basis. And there's an article that came out a few years ago. I think it's "What Are You Going to Do? Shoot Me?" And it goes through this union contract fight in a rural part of Pennsylvania, where teachers did go on strike, and there was this very concerted effort from the bargaining board for the school district to pit the teachers union against the relatively low wage, blue collar workers in that community, so that they could force on them a much worse contract. And this is really in stark contrast to what we saw in West Virginia, Kentucky, Oklahoma, and Arizona, where, there had been decades of neoliberal reforms that sought to privatize education, to stall any type of public union interests. And in all four of those states as well, the difference was none of those states allow for collective bargaining rights for teachers. And so the only course of action had to be direct action, because the primary education unions had been attempting lobbying efforts with increasingly hostile legislators who would use culture war talking points to deride them. They would siphon public funds away. They would reduce taxes on oil or natural gas or coal subsidies so that public services receive far less funding over the years. And it got to a point where that was really the only course of action that educators could take. And I think because those interests have also directly impacted the communities in which educators live and work, it was not just an issue of education. It was a movement led by educators and service personnel, but by no means was one that only affected us. And so I think that's why you saw such great outpouring of support from people, as well as people who saw those strike waves and said, this is great. I want a union myself. And so that has a knock-on effect that we are now seeing here, even at West Virginia University, where student-led movements, graduate workers, faculty, and staff are fighting against very harsh, regressive cuts. These are movements being led by students who would have been in late middle school or early high school when the strike wave happened, and they took the experiences from their teachers and are now using it very directly against a hostile university administration. And I think it's incredible to see, really.
Yeah, no, and it's fascinating. I mean, the way the reverberations that one gets from a movement like this. And if I recall correctly, the correction officers in the West Virginia prisons, the strike was also in support of more wages for them. Is that correct?
Yes, the ultimate goal of the 2018 strike was to increase the health insurance benefits, the PEIA, which affects all public employees, in the state, as well as increasing the salaries for all public employees. And so technically, the way that we looked at it, educators were the only ones who could feasibly shut down the state because of the power that they had, but ultimately all public employees, regardless of whether they were teachers or not, received that 5% wage increase, as well as at least temporary freeze to any changes to their health insurance for a little over a year.
And so I would imagine that also helped garner broader support for the strike. I wanted to ask you, Brendan, where did the pre-existing teachers unions fit into this? I really get the sense of this as more of a grassroots kind of wildcat action initially. I know they stepped in and were supportive, I think fairly early on or at some point, but how did this movement in its formation and unfolding, what was the relationship with the pre-existing teachers union organizations?
Sure. We really try to catalog the relationships and history of the pre-existing education unions in the 4 surveyed states. And one example from Jefferson County in Kentucky, which is the only county in Kentucky that has collective bargaining rights for teachers, is a very stark example because it's where the city of Louisville is located. It's a predominantly non-white city, yet the head of the teachers union there, at least at the time, was a white man who had been in that position for a number of years. And his experience was directly related to how to directly lobby the Kentucky legislature and the Kentucky governor's office to ensure that benefits would continue in the county as well as in the state. Yet between the couplings of social justice movements, community movements in support of educators, and Black Lives Matter groups that were connected with BIPOC educators in the city of Louisville, their focus was both a social justice component, trying to stop what was then called the gang crime bill, which would directly target a lot of Louisville's Black and brown students. When that happened, the head of the Jefferson County Teachers Association didn't want a major strike to happen, and when it did, wanted to get out in front of it and really just focus on some very core bread and butter issues. But the Jefferson County teachers themselves wanted this to be a much larger, much more broad, encompassing strike action, and I believe had gone on strike a few times without the rest of the state support, to focus on legislation that was coming that would directly impact their communities. And you see this tension where educators who got directly involved in the strike action, who relied on community networks and support, became ostracized by their unions. That happened in West Virginia. Jay O'Neill, I write in the book, came to his union with ideas prior to the strike. He would get non-committal responses. He wouldn't get follow-up emails. And that was sort of the genesis for creating the Facebook group that ultimately helped lead to this strike action, and ended up creating a lot more tension, I think, between the rank and file movement and the heads of the education unions. And at least in West Virginia's case, our rank and file caucus put forth a slate of candidates for office in the union. I think we garnered around 40% of the vote from delegates, which was a very, very big win for this first showing. But it was very obvious that the history of this strike was being told in two separate ways. One that was being told from the top down of trying to cater the history that would benefit those who are considered union leaders, and those that were, I would argue, probably more accurate, that showed a lot of discontent with existing union infrastructure and union tactics, and an attempt to reclaim the militancy of the labor movement within education unions.
And that's such an important point. It's the point that I think you and your co-author Aaron Dyke address in the book, because that seems to me this top-down versus lateral question. It seems to me is inseparable from. It has many dimensions, but one of them is certainly the racial one. Is in a situation like you described, where there's a white leader of the local union in a place that has largely Black population, including student population, and you touch on this issue of parentheses white professionalization, and this is a little bit of what I was touching on earlier. There's this tension now between the history and the identification of the working class, white and Black, and what some people call the PMC, the professional managerial class of that, for example, the Democratic Party seems to have gravitated towards, as opposed to working people in general. And as you guys state, it's a bit of a stretch, you write, on our part to consider movements toward white professionalization alongside other unionisms, as its tradition of understanding power and change are often opposed to unionization. I think that's a little bit of what you were talking about in the Louisville example, right? That you have a kind of cultural identification among some people involved with this sort of white associated class differential that does not consider itself working class, and those people within the education workforce who do. Is that question making any sense to you?
Oh, absolutely. And I think this might go back a little bit to the point you were making earlier, too, Richard, where the distinction between educators as part of the working class, as opposed to, say, a mechanic or an electrician or maybe someone in the building trades, was an intentional part of the National Education Association's identity for much of its first 100 years. I think the first large-scale statewide NEA strike was in Florida in the late 60s, but prior to that, the NEA had both a segregated union that had to sort of be forced to integrate itself with its non-white members. It had to come to terms with the fact that even though at the time, and especially now, female educators make up the majority of the workforce, but in the NEA, most of the individuals who had led the union at the time, up until the 60s and 70s, were mostly white men. The identity to be this white professional middle class, that education was a career that could provide a stable living, but the trade-off was you not only get, summers off and some of the other benefits that teachers get, but you're also distancing yourself from the working class and other unions as a whole, because you don't go on strike, you don't cause disruptions, because you're here just to serve the students. And so a lot of the, I would say, maybe right-wing talking points that we see targeting teachers were in part coming from the teachers union, or at least from the NEA itself, for a number of years. Now, obviously, that's changed in the past several decades, which is beneficial. But I think that identity of educators as in that white professional middle class was something that was partly done to insulate educators from the broader union movement and some more large-scale civil rights movements of the 60s and 70s.
As a person who specializes in pedagogy studies, you must know, one of my favorites, I'm sure you do, Paulo Freire, who used to talk about internalizing the oppressor consciousness. And to the extent that teachers are convinced they're not part of the working class, that somehow they enjoy a different status that makes it beneath them somehow to organize, instead of a privilege to organize and a duty to organize, that holds them back, doesn't it?
And I'll share a story from the book too. One of the individuals I interviewed, Matt McCormack, he taught at Mercer County in the southern end of West Virginia, and he shared a picture of his paycheck, or I think it was his bank statement, and he said, "This is what we have after we've paid all of our bills, taxes have come out, health insurance, premiums, deductibles, mortgage, car, everything else that they had to pay for." And I think he had like $1 or $2 in his account. And he said, something along the lines of, "Am I the only one?" And other educators started sharing how much they had in their accounts and how little they had of spending money after all their bills were paid. And it became an important dialogue point, I think, for many educators who, just because of the nature of the profession, you're in a classroom by yourself for the majority of the day. You're responsible for the lessons, you're responsible for grading, you're responsible for the managing of your classroom. It becomes very isolating just by nature of the work that teachers do. And so whenever you see these financial statements and you think that this must be just a personal failing on my part,
Right.
it helps to isolate educators further. But his post and the information he shared showed others that it's not a personal moral failing. It is a direct policy choice from legislators and elected officials to directly underfund education and thereby underpay teachers what they deserve. And that was one of the bigger sparks, I think, between changing also what we would call trade union consciousness, which is this understanding that any benefits that you're working to accrue should benefit directly your trade or industry into a larger class consciousness.
Right.
And my former union president in Ohio County, Jenny Craig, she had helped with distributing backpacks that had school lunches, folders, notebooks, everything to striking machinists not too far from my house, and wanted directly to have the local education unions provide this for these families, because we knew they couldn't afford a lot of the back to school supplies, and we wanted them to be prepared. And so there was this mixing of, this isn't just a teacher movement, this isn't an education movement, this is part of a larger working class issue of fighting back against people who have too much power, too much money, and too much influence, and are telling us that we should be okay with scraps.
Right, exactly. And as in the minute or two we have left, I mean, it's a big question, and I apologize for that, but I was just thinking, did you come away from I know the actions took place, there were some concessions, I believe, were partially or somewhat taken back in later legislative sessions and so on. But did you come away from this feeling optimistic about what we've learned and can continue to learn from this action? Did you come away feeling more positive, less positive, the same about the labor movement overall? Any closing thoughts about any of that?
I think finishing the book was tough in a lot of ways, because it did bring up a lot of feelings that I and others had, that the strike, albeit powerful, didn't have the material impacts that we had wanted, because we still have to work against a very hostile legislature, and organizing is tough. You want to just be able to do your job and to do it well and to go home and see your families. You don't want to have to keep doing this over and over again. And I think if there's anything that I think we've learned over the course of the past 5 years, is that, it simply can't just be one industry that is taking on these fights. It has to be other unions. It has to be new unions that are sparking up in separate industries, like we're seeing with the Starbucks workers, that it's expanding beyond a single industry. And when that happens, I think it's a lot easier to feel the weight coming off your shoulders and not having to feel like, educators have to continue striking year after year for these benefits, that others can start to handle that load, as well as understanding what those tactics look like and what issues you're going to face when you do it. And ultimately, that is why we wrote the book, was both to provide a more thorough history and analysis of the strikes and how to engage in that type of action, but also what you learn from it, because everyone came away from these strike actions with different perspectives. But if they built organizations that could directly challenge powerful people afterwards, their success is what would lead to future successes. But if they didn't, and those things started to collapse or fall away, then it was much easier for legislators to kind of circle the wagon and attack again, because they knew that workforce was much weaker.
Yeah, they don't give up, those guys. That's one of the big takeaways. Well, listen, I think you guys have done a great service in writing this book. And again, the book is Rank and File Rebels. Let me find that subtitle again. I'm not going to find it real quickly. Yes, I can. It is Rank and File Rebels, Theories of Power and Change in the 2018 Education Strike. It is by Aaron Dyke and my guest, Brendan Muckian-Bates. Brendan, thank you so much for your great work and putting this book together, and as an educator, and thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks so much, Richard.
And we'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is the Zero Hour.